Sarah, thank you so much for joining me again for another episode of this podcast. You are becoming a piece of the furniture now, is that how I'm saying it?
I'm here regularly and I love doing these podcasts.
I should get like a permanent Sarah wall sticker.
Cardboard cutout.
Yeah, cardboard cutout, absolutely. So, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to have you.
It's great to be here.
I just love talking to you about all the things that you're an expert on. The thing that we're talking about today, with it being Neurodiversity Week, is one of your expertise areas, ADHD.
Yes.
But specifically, how you navigate kind of having ADHD symptoms and a successful career, correct? Because we're seeing a lot of stuff. We don't want to do another neurodiverse podcast. I mean, we do, but we also don't. We want it to bring some value to something we're not necessarily seeing people talk about. And I think you and I mentioned we see it. How do you kind of manage ADHD in like personal life and home life, but we don't necessarily see it in terms of like your career span.
Yes.
Making that successful.
Yeah. Exactly that. There's a huge amount of information there, but excuse me, not a lot of it's very specific on managing it in the workplace and managing your career longer term with that. Yeah,
and that is definitely your expertise area. Did you want to talk me through kind of how you got into studying this part of neurodiversity?
Yeah, sure. So after I set up my business, it was literally headlong into lockdown and homeschooling my little one. And I realised with her that it was really difficult to get her to sit and do her home learning unless I got her to move.
Okay.
So
you mean physically moving?
Physically moving.
Yeah.
So I'd sit down to do her maths homework, and it would be 3 hours fighting, tears, screaming, mostly mine. It was an absolute nightmare. And then I got her to do a question and a cartwheel, and a question and a handstand, and a question and a cartwheel. Done. That's 25 minutes, bish bash bosh, finished.
Really? So what was that? Her attention span was quite short?
Well, it wasn't that her attention span was short, but just physically having to sit quietly to do was really hard. And then I watched her. She had 2 teachers basically. For 3 days a week it was her form tutor, and for 2 days a week it was her headmistress, and she'd read for 10 minutes with them as part of the homeschooling through lockdown. And with her form tutor, sit down, sit still, stop fidgeting, and she'd get 2 pages read, if that. And we just got her a dyslexia diagnosis, so we knew that reading was a challenge anyway, but the sitting down was. Whereas her headmistress was like, oh, show me a downward dog, how's your yoga going? And really engaging with her and getting her to move.
Yeah.
And we get 5 or 6 pages read.
Brilliant.
So this started to get me curious. And one thing that I do is I will hyper-focus on a topic and I'll just deep dive into it, and I have to know all the things. Thank goodness I have a computer in my pocket and my phone. I don't know how I would have coped before that. So off I went with loads of research. She'd never been a good sleeper. She'd always been really active. She'd woken up 1,000 times every night. She was, all of these things, and it all really started to ring the bell. Now, my other half is really, she's fine. Even with the dyslexia diagnosis, he was pushing against it, despite being dyslexic himself.
Interesting.
And so I was talking to a friend of mine who's a psychologist and said, I don't know how to approach it with him. And she said, why don't you get your diagnosis first? I was like, my what? Excuse me? And she basically said, like, seriously, surely you have recognised that in yourself.
Yeah.
Another days of hyper focus and research. And it was like every light bulb on the planet went off for me. It just made so much sense.
Did you feel at that point quite seen? Because, you're not going to change your mannerisms or behaviours, but you can start to understand why you do what you do.
100%.
Yeah.
Suddenly I was able to be much more kind to myself.
Yeah.
And give myself a lot more grace for some of the challenges that come.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so that's what kind of created the passion.
Yeah.
You and your daughter have ADHD.
Yeah, exactly that.
Okay.
So I am diagnosed. My daughter isn't.
Okay.
My daughter's being monitored at her school to see whether she's showing enough signs, because now they've changed childhood diagnosis. You have to be referred by the school and home.
Right.
It can't only be from home.
Yeah.
And yeah, so in my coaching, I realised that a lot of the people that I was working with had ADHD or suspected they had ADHD. And everything I was talking about, resilience, inner critic, psychological safety, is so very relevant for people who are neurodivergent. And it's relevant for everyone, but it's especially challenging and meaningful for people who are neurodivergent.
So with that in mind, Sarah, that people with ADHD or that are neurodivergent will, have more challenges in the workplace. Actually, on that note, ADHD, how am I wording this? Am I saying a person with ADHD, an ADHD person? What's the right phrase for this?
Great question, and there is no right or wrong answer. So there are broadly two schools of thought. So some people like myself who will say I am ADHD, it's part of my personality, it's part of my identity, that's who I am.
Right.
And then there are other people who will say that they have ADHD, it's something that exists as part of them, but it's something that they've got rather than something that they are.
Interesting. There's quite a lot of psychology around that then, which one you feel comfortable with. Okay, fine. For this, we're going to say someone with ADHD.
Yeah.
So, now that you've been diagnosed later in life, looking back at your career, how do you feel that's impacted you at all?
Oh, hugely.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting looking back with that gift of hindsight to see how many times it was at play in positive and in negative ways. So when I first left university, I knew that I was a people person, I was very extroverted, I liked talking to people, so I thought recruitment would be perfect.
Did you?
I was in recruitment for a couple of years, but I'm not a completer finisher, and it was a disaster. It really wasn't.
You have to get back to your candidates.
And another part, I'll come on to it a bit more later, but rejection sensitivity is massive for ADHDers.
Okay.
So I was having almost like vicarious rejection on behalf of my candidates and finding that really hard. I'd be so invested in them, in the role. I'd find it really hard when they weren't successful, or if I didn't get the specs from a client. It was just, it was not a good month for me at all.
Too much kind of out of your control.
Yeah. And so I hopped around a few jobs at the beginning of my career very quickly because I couldn't find what was really right for me, and I ended up working at a large mobile phone company on their IT service desk, because actually I was great with technology and I was great in a crisis, and the head of IT recognised that I was really good in that change management, incident management, problem management space. I could think about 14 different things all at the same time. I did all of that risk analysis incredibly quickly. Like I was in my zone.
Brilliant.
And so I moved across. It had never been something I was even aware of, and moved into service management from there, and ended up again moving between different industries because I needed that sense of newness, to learn something new, to do something different. And I was always promoted quite quickly because I picked up concepts very quickly, which is a real benefit of ADHD. We're very quick to problem solve, we're very quick to grasp ideas.
I was going to say, outside in, is that something like having to move at pace, having to do things at pace, or have regular change?
Yes.
Yeah?
For the majority. So what I will say is, if you've met one person with ADHD, you've met one person with ADHD. Everyone presents differently. And there are so many crossovers. So somebody might have dyslexia and dyscalculia and dyspraxia, all of the different...
I think I've got dyspraxia. Is that the movement one?
Yeah, where you trip over things. And...
I've tripped twice in the last 2 days. Face planted the tarmac. That's maybe a story for another day.
With Maggie Simpson.
Yeah, yesterday I managed to fall out of my car whilst getting into my car.
Okay.
Yeah.
That might be worth looking into.
We'll take that one offline.
Yeah, I've completely lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. So, yeah, looking at the fact that everyone is slightly different, but for me and for a lot of people with ADHD, having lots of different things to do keeps us interested, keeps us motivated, and keeps some deadlines and some pressure on us.
Yeah.
So even now I recognise if I've got 3 things on my to-do list, I'll do 1. If I've got 30 things on my to-do list, I'll do 27.
Right.
It's a real, like, when the pressure's on, when there's lots going on, I can really get on with it.
Wow.
But when it's a bit quiet,
you drag your feet.
really badly. Which obviously can be frustrating for a manager if they don't understand what's going on. It's like, you've got nothing on, how can't you finish?
That is so interesting. Okay, so how could somebody with ADHD, recognise that about themselves and put things in place to be their best self all the time?
So it's really interesting, and I don't really want to talk about technical terms too much, but I am going to mention situational variability.
Okay.
So this is something that crops up for people with ADHD, and it's not about being lazy when you can't be bothered and really focused when you want to be. It's neuroscience. It's the availability of things like dopamine to somebody with ADHD to be able to get the work done. So when it's really interesting, when there's a consequence connected to it, or when somebody's got a deadline looming, there's dopamine available for somebody with ADHD to be able to really smash through the task, and we can get 3 weeks work done in 3 days when we're on fire, which also then potentially leads to burnout, but that's a different podcast. I think. Whereas if it's not especially interesting, or it's there's no deadline, it can be really hard to get going with it. So it's really easy for somebody with ADHD to get lots of things done when everything's really busy, which is why I was so great in operational management roles, because there was always really reactive. There's always a fire going on. There's always something to do. No, you can gamify that. Okay. So whether you're a manager working with an employee who has ADHD, or you're someone who has ADHD who recognises this, finding ways to gamify it. So false deadlines don't work, but perhaps you could put check-ins with your team, with the client, with your manager. So you have to have done some of the work because you've got that check-in.
Okay.
Or you find aspects that you find more dull, and utilise a colleague where you work together on something that's boring. Now, I discovered this accidentally with cleaning and cooking.
Okay.
I clean and cook far better if I've got someone with me. I can chat. And it's called body doubling. And it's a thing for particularly people with ADHD, because you get a dopamine boost from being with somebody. You get a dopamine boost from the accountability. So there are platforms out there literally for ADHDers. Sign up, you join a Zoom call, and you get your boring work done.
That is so
and it's
clever.
Incredible. But in the workplace, you could do it with a colleague.
Yes.
You've got filing to get done, you've got notes to write up, you're putting it off, you're procrastinating. Sit down with a colleague, bosh through it.
That's so interesting. Like the other colleague would help you be accountable, but actually if they're doing it with you, you get the comfort and the company. I mean, I could definitely relate to that, and I think in the role that we do, in every role there's always a task you don't want to do, and I think in recruitment sometimes that can be the slightly colder outreach, which we have to do. We have to start building new relationships, and that's something that people tend to put to the bottom of their task list in a day. And every company I've been in, there's been success where you group in teams and you have joint call sessions. We might call it a sales day, like something to motivate you to pick up the phone that day, and you're doing it together. And when you break it down, people that are years into the role, they might say, well, why do you need that? Why do you need that motivation? It's your day job, just do it. But actually there are so many people that really benefit from knowing the person next to them is doing the same task.
Absolutely.
So that's really interesting insight.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that you say that as well, because quite often the adjustments that we ask for someone who is neurodivergent in the workplace really helps people who are neurotypical as well. It's not that it's only the people with a neurodivergent condition that are going to benefit from different ways of working. So tapping into somebody with ADHD's creativity, tapping into their desire to be busy, tapping into their hyper-focus are brilliant ways to keep them engaged and therefore hopefully retain them for longer and help them develop their career. Whereas for me, I'd get everything into a good shape and then I'd be a bit bored, so I'd move on.
Got you.
And as my career developed, I learned different tools to keep myself occupied, to keep myself focused and on track. But a lot of the productivity hacks that most people would use don't always work for those of us with ADHD.
No.
So working out different ways of doing things has been really interesting, and seeing how it works for my clients is really interesting as well.
So you mentioned kind of the impact that ADHD had, you know, in retrospect on your career, and the fact that initially you were job hopping, kind of, things weren't sticking because it didn't feel right for you, but when you started to understand where your strengths lay and how to harness that with ADHD, you were actually able to be promoted and flourish within your career and see out a number of roles. So that's really, really interesting. And I was just thinking, as somebody with ADHD and someone that has studied this extensively, what advice and pieces of information or education can you give to hiring managers that may have members in their team that have ADHD?
Yeah, great question. So the first thing I would say is to talk to your employees, to understand how ADHD shows up for them and to ensure that they feel safe enough to share that. Because there is a perception that, you know, ADHD is that naughty boy who can't sit still and runs around, and there are different ways that ADHD shows up. You know, there's the hyperactivity, which you might see somebody who's very fidgety, and maybe it's about enabling them in a meeting to doodle, to recognise that that's not them being distracted, that's actually enabling them to focus. You know, even fidget toys. Because I know that I will pay far better attention if I can doodle and fiddle with stuff than if I'm...
We've heard that a couple of clients, they've put fidgets in their meeting rooms. And at first the exec were like, what's this about? Are we children? And they're like, just wait, you might be. And they all started using it and really enjoying it, and then they go into a meeting, they're looking for it. But actually it just gives you, what is it? Like, so what does it do?
Well, again, without going too deep into the neuroscience, there are two tracks in your brain. There's default mode network and the task positive network. And task positive is when you're focused, and default mode is the daydreamy bit. And with an ADHD brain, you jump tracks quite quickly and quite easily. So a fidget, doodling, whatever, keeps the default mode network busy so that the thinking part of your brain can get on with the task positive.
That's what it felt like, but I couldn't put it into words as you did. That's great. Okay, so things like that we can think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there are challenges, I guess, that come with ADHD. Again, I'm going to throw a couple of slightly technical terms out, apologies. So object permanence. For somebody with ADHD, they may be more likely to have a messy desk. And as a manager, that might get, or as a team member, that might get quite frustrating. And you'll probably have realised that your ADHD employee, although they've got a messy desk, can find what they need in a heartbeat, despite the chaos. And this thing called object permanence means that for an ADHD brain, out of sight is literally out of mind. It kind of ceases to exist. So when everything's nicely tidied and filed, they can't find it. So again, it's enabling your ADHD employee to play to their strengths and to have that slightly chaotic desk if they need to be able to get stuff out and know where everything is, rather than have it all nice and tidy away.
That really goes against the grain though, doesn't it?
It really does.
What managers are going to say, I've hacked it, everyone have a messy desk.
You're free to have a messy desk if you want to.
Interesting.
And actually I think that it's really interesting now, people working from home more, that they can do that, and therefore perhaps they are being more productive.
I do think that's important, like thinking about your home, you know, work setting. People are in my opinion, really productive from home because, well, they can be, because they've set their work setting out how they want it and what works for them. Obviously, we know they're going to likely be sat at their desk for longer, less distractions, but then there'll be managers that have the idea that it's the other way around, that, you know, from home they're distracted, they're not focusing on work, they have to be in the office in order to focus. But actually, what you're saying there, if their desk environment, work environment isn't suitable to their mindset, they're just not going to have the focus, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that means with object permanence is that visual reminders and visual cues are really important.
Okay, yeah.
So it's the post-its on the screen, it's all of the obvious notes and reminders that can be incredibly helpful for somebody with ADHD.
Brilliant. And that's something that a manager can absolutely harness, because, you know, if there are certain tasks that need to be done in a day, repetitive things, you can absolutely have that factored into the workplace, around the screen, on the desktop, in a little frame, on the wall, in a mood board.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think and obviously it depends on the type of role, but I was working with one person who'd been promoted into a managerial role and was really struggling because nothing was written down. And they wanted to get everything written down and put into a book, kind of, so that they had everything there, which seems very countercultural to the ADHD.
Maybe, Oh, right.
It's just kind of... and I was helping her advocate for herself at work to say, I need this for me to be able to be really productive, because I just don't retain. Working memory can be really problematic for people with dyslexia, which often coexists with ADHD, and so it's about advocating for the needs that you've got in the workplace.
And there was something you mentioned when you were talking about your career, and something that would make somebody prone to moving on, and it was rejection sensitivity disorder.
Yes.
So what is that?
Rejection sensitivity dysphoria.
Dysphoria, okay.
So the technical of it, so it occurs for people who have ADHD and people with autism, or autism spectrum disorder. I hate the disordered dysphoria language, but anyway.
It doesn't sound very just, does it?
No. So someone with rejection sensitivity or rejection sensitive dysphoria will have almost a physical feeling of pain when they feel criticised or rejected, whether that's real or imagined. And it can be really emotionally draining, and it can cause a real kind of emotional dysregulation to occur. So if you're in a very political, bordering on toxic work environment, someone who's neurotypical, you think, that's just Bill, he's being Bill, and it's fine, it's not personal. Someone with ADHD or autism spectrum who have RSD as well, it's absolutely personal. And it will, the number of times I cried in the toilets when I was in those sorts of environments, because I presumed, I physically felt like it was all about me. And that it was me not doing my job properly, and it was me being hated by people, and it was me not fitting in. And I can look back on it and recognise how not true that was. But in those environments, it feels horrific. And it can be as simple as the boss saying, can I have a chat with you later on? Between that being said and the chat, what have I done wrong? What
People been there.
What ball have I dropped? I'm about to get fired. And actually, the email going, nothing to worry about, but can we have a chat a bit later? Nothing to worry about, well, I've clearly got something to worry about then. I'm absolutely going to get my P45. So it's that sense of real visceral reaction to, and it physically hurts.
With that in mind then, I'm just thinking of people that might be listening that recognise that in themselves. That's a really horrible thing to go through. And you mentioned, I recognised it, that I was seeing it in a more skewed way. But how can we manage it? Remedy it?
We can't. We are ourselves, being aware of it and bringing yourself back to balance more quickly. There are tools in place that can help you get your parasympathetic nervous system back on track.
Okay.
So when you've had that emotional dysregulation and you're upset,
so when you're in like fight or flight,
breathing type things, you can bring yourself back to the moment, but it's not going to stop it happening. What will is advocating for yourself and helping people understand the impact that these things are having. So saying to your boss, look, can you say, I really need to understand what's happening on that project. Yeah. I know I'm due an update email tomorrow, but I've got a meeting with Jane at 3, so can you just give me a quick update at 2? I've got nothing to worry about now.
Yeah.
It took him or her 25 seconds as opposed to 2 seconds.
Yeah.
But I'm now productive for the rest of the day rather than bawling my eyes out in the toilets because of something.
That makes complete sense. So not necessarily the person with ADHD thinking, I've got this, symptom of it and I need to change or manage it. No, you need people around you to be aware of how you react and try and edit their behaviour.
And it's a bit of both. I'm never gonna, there's always going to be somebody who says or does something that I'm going to go, okay, they hate me, I'm dreadful at my job. It really can accentuate any sense of imposter syndrome or the inner critic, which is another one of my favourite topics. But recognising it and bringing yourself back to balance more quickly and having people around you that can adjust their behaviour so that it's less upsetting or less impactful. But it does mean that somebody with ADHD probably won't cope as well in a political or highly political organisation, or certainly no toxic environments, whereas somebody who's neurotypical perhaps can, they can leave it at the door and know that it is what it is, whereas somebody who's neurodivergent would find that harder.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I think if you've got ADHD and you're struggling with that, it's good to do that health check on the environment you're in.
Absolutely.
And is that right for you? Have you got the minerals to continue in that workplace, or are you better finding a slightly different one?
And then as a manager, making sure that you're really building psychological safety for your team, because if your team has psychological safety, automatically you're reducing the risk of rejection sensitive emotional dysregulation, because they recognise that they're valued and that their voice is important.
So we've covered so much today, really explored a deeper dive into ADHD, and there's actually a lot more we could talk about. But what I wanted to finish on was, if you could give yourself, like when we look back now to your younger self, if you could give your younger self one piece of advice, knowing that she has ADHD, what would it be?
That is such an amazing question. I think the core of my message to my younger self is to cut myself a bit more slack and to be a bit more kind to myself. Because I think it's very easy, as somebody with ADHD, particularly someone who doesn't realise that they have ADHD, to look around and assume that everyone else has got it nailed and you're the only one that's struggling. Because what you've not realised is that you've got, or I hadn't realised I had one hand tied behind my back. Everyone else had two hands and I didn't. So I think that will be it, like be a bit more kind, and I still hold myself to ridiculously high standards, but I think that might have been something that I would have told my younger self, like just cut yourself some slack, chill out, it's okay, you're doing okay.
I think that's brilliant, and like you said there, you were always doing the best you could at the time.
Exactly.
So, if you had one hand tied behind your back, you were doing a great job with that hand tied behind your back. So why see yourself as inadequate in any scenario, regardless of ADHD? I think that's perfect advice for everyone. At every stage in our life, we should be kinder to ourselves, and those feelings of rejection will ease, and our instant emotional outbursts will ease, because we start to see things more rationally and digest the information we're given in a calmer way.
Yeah, exactly that.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
As ever, it's been an absolute pleasure.
There's going to be another one, I'm sure.
Most probably. Anytime.
Thank you.